Well, let's talk about the role of music in Jewish life. I mean, people think of Fiddler on the Roof, Jews wandering around Europe with a violin tucked under their arm. But what actually is the role of music in Jewish devotions?
Music historically inside Judaism has had different kinds of roles. I think that in Fiddler on the Roof you find in some way a characterization that's partially true. It's a distillation of a lot of things, but it's sometimes taken a little bit too far to a point of no longer being recognizable because it needs to be a universal message that's left in the end. Jewish melody is not something there just in order to have a good night at the opera or, in Broadway as the case may be. When Jews wrote music, and they did write music, some people think there were no Bachs or Beethovens. Of course we had our great Jewish geniuses. They simply didn't search for public acclaim as the German virtuosos did. Among the Jewish composers that we have are not only people who are technically Jewish, like Mahler or Mendelssohn. We have our own Jewish geniuses like Sulzer, people who wrote music that specifically was for the Jewish religious service, brilliant choral melodies and settings for orchestra, Lewandowski. These are things that, like so much of Jewish culture, was destroyed by the Holocaust. It's difficult today to imagine that there are hundreds and hundreds of pieces that were composed for orchestra and choir that were specifically for the religious service to be held inside the synagogue. Matter of fact, one of Beethoven's final compositions was to be used for the dedication of the temple in Vienna. These are things that are crossroads. Vienna was not simply the high point of Catholic culture. It was also a point where Jews also sought the limelight. They sought the place for their culture to be acknowledged as well. When you talk about Jewish melodies at the times that they were composed in those days, remember that these were not things that were written for mass public consumption. They weren't meant to be sung or whistled while going down the street by everybody. In some cases, you had a centuries-old tradition that had built itself up where great rabbis, geniuses of their generation, were not only great scholars who could write tremendous texts about the most tiniest of minutiae from the Talmud. They were also composers. We might not see them in that same sense as we understand a composer today, but they would, inside their devotion, inside their personal relationship with God, they would create these melodies that would bring themselves to a higher level of consciousness.
That's what I want to ask you about, what the music is actually doing in a religious, spiritual manner for the one who is at prayer.
Well, there are different melodies for different purposes. Sometimes there are melodies that are for an entire group of people to sing as the prayers are being recited. There are melodies that are for a single individual. Try to imagine a melody that lasts a half an hour long, extremely intense and complicated, but it brings a person through a story as an Odyssey would. A melody that's so extremely complicated, it takes its own particular discipline. And when a person sings that melody, a person is changed by that. Any cares that a person might have had in the beginning become trivial. A person becomes lighter through the learning of the melody, particularly when the melody is associated with a particular experience that a rabbi or a saint might have had. And some of these are hundreds of years old. They're quite extraordinary when they're heard today, but we need to listen to them with the ears of yesterday. And most people don't necessarily have that ability. The melodies are very rich and they're very varied and they take some time to learn. Some of them are in musical modes that we don't hear anymore, like Freygish or Mishaberach.
What's Freygish? So
Freygish is a Jewish variation of an old church mode. We know the sound from the synagogue. Ya-da, da, da, ya-da, ya-dum, ya-da, da, ya-dum, da-dum. Or Mishaberach with something like a minor chord with a sharp 4. Da 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 ya da ya da da ya ya di ya da da dum. These are different sounds. I mean, people would call those blues sounds. Well, they are actually related to blues sounds as we know them from the American blacks, but these sounds go back hundreds of years from the Jews in Central and Eastern Europe.